Good morning and welcome to day 3 of the 2021 Housing Assembly, Creating Socially Valuable Housing. My name is Rory Hyde and I'm Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Melbourne, Chair of this session, Retrofitting the Suburbs. I'm pleased to host two brilliant speakers, Dana Cuff and Maryam Gusheh. First, I'll give a brief introduction, which is a short plug for our recent issue of Architecture Australia, which looks at this theme of the suburbs. And this is drawn from the introduction. We architects have tended to see the suburbs as either a problem to be solved or somewhere to be avoided. Robin Boyd famously railed against the stifling limitations of life in the suburban house, writing, "Is it just me? Is it just that the Australian public clings to its depressing little boxes because it knows no better, has seen no better design?" Gabrielle Poole has said, "The suburbs we're putting up are just bloody inhuman. How people live in them, I just don't know." And according to our only Pritzker Prize winner, Glenn Murcutt, it's appalling housing, it's appalling spatially, it's not architecture, it's merchandise. Perhaps as though excusing us from our responsibility. So we decry suburbia's sameness, the stifling individualism, the apparent lack of culture, the sprawl, the cars and their air conditioners. Some architects even refuse to work there, claiming it's bad for their portfolios. But are the suburbs at last coming into their own? We've seen a radical redrawing of the social and economic geography of Australian cities as COVID forced many of us to work from home, focusing our existence on our immediate neighbourhoods. Even now, as some of us tentatively return to the office, this experience has not been forgotten as people seek out more space and light and anticipate commuting fewer days in the week. Rather than dragging us all under, The Economist predicts that a new age of suburbanisation could be dawning. Is it time that architects surrendered their prejudices and embraced the suburbs? To show how this might be possible, we've invited Dana and Maryam to present their work, which operates on this territory in different but complementary ways. What unites their approaches is working with what's there, to take the suburbs on their own terms rather than seeking to replace it with something else. Dana Cuff is Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at UCLA, where she is the Director of cityLAB, an award-winning think tank that advances experimental urbanism and architecture. Her work focuses on affordable housing, modernism, suburban studies, the politics of place, and the spatial implications of new computer technologies. She's the author of many books, including Architecture, the Story of Practice, which remains the defining text on culture of the profession, and The Provisional City, a study of residential architecture's role in transforming Los Angeles over the past century. She founded cityLAB in 2006 and has since concentrated her efforts around issues of spatial justice in the emerging metropolis. Cuff also holds an adjunct professorship with Monash University, so I'm pleased to also introduce Maryam Gusheh, who is Associate Professor in Architecture at Monash. Gusheh is a researcher and design educator with specialisation in 20th century architectural culture, extending to the contemporary period. She has a particular interest in bridging academia and industry, conceptualising and realising projects that span these worlds. Prior to joining Monash in 2018, Maryam was the Director of Architecture Department at the University of New South Wales, and she's a practice critic at Neeson Murcutt Architects. Please welcome Dana and Maryam. Thrilled you can join us. Please post your questions as we go, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. And Dana, we will start with you. Welcome. I saw you popped up there. We'll bring you straight back.
Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen. And I'm actually really glad to hear, Rory, the kind of introduction that you gave. Let's see, that's not the screen I want to share. Hold on. Because I think I no longer hold those views that we've talked about for so long in architecture as the kind of denigration of the suburbs. In a way, it's more important than anything else to try to think through how we enter the post-suburban city than that we refuse to operate there. And maybe I've lived in Los Angeles too long, but I've also collaborated with a number of colleagues in Melbourne and seen the kind of work that's going on in Australia. So I think there's a lot of hope for the basic idea that we do have a way now of transforming the suburbs. I presume my screen is now visible to everyone. So I'm going to talk about this idea of the post-suburban city, and in particular talk about how design research, policy, and zoning can operate to increase our supplies of affordable housing that's suitable for the cities where that housing is being built. All the work that I do comes from my center, which Rory referred to, cityLAB, based in the Architecture and Urban Design Department here at UCLA. This is the team. It's made up of the top row of core staff, and all the rest are students who stay with us for anywhere from 1 to 5 years, depending on the programs they're in. And they are really the fuel and intellectual force behind all the projects that I'm going to show you. cityLAB is very much a place where I think mentorship and training of a new generation of architects needs to take place. Just to show you how cityLAB operates, it's actually a 3-part structure that's only recently taken on this form. It's looking and based in Los Angeles, but it's the implications of the work we do generally spread much further than that. About 10 years ago, we, with Mellon Foundation funding, began a real curricular program called Urban Humanities, or the Urban Humanities Institute. That's very much based in Los Angeles, which you see at the left of your screen. And because after working for 15 years out of the campus lab and site, seemed restrictive in many ways, because we're now really deeply embedded with community-based partners, we started in 2019 something called CoLab, where we have long-term partners of various community institutions with whom we undertake our research. And I should just say that all of the research that cityLAB undertakes, unlike a community design center, is initiated by us as we look at what the pressing problems are that are spatially and urbanistically given, and where we really feel design can operate as a lever to explore new solutions. So all the work we do is really very much what I would call design research. Our laboratory provides us plenty of opportunities to think about affordable housing. Just in these simple graphics and data points, you can see that California, of the 50 states in the United States, is by far the most unaffordable. More people are cost burdened by the cost of housing. And I know Australia, and Melbourne in particular, has similarly horrifying figures, but the median house price in California, the entire state, is now over $800,000, and that's twice the national level. So there's no place like California where affordable housing is as egregious a problem. That's manifested in the fact that we also have 25% of the unhoused population in the United States, even though we have just 12% of the population, and we have the highest rate of poverty in the US, which isn't something that is well understood even in the US. So in thinking about how to provide affordable housing through new mechanisms, we realized that there was already a form of affordable housing that was occurring naturally or indigenously in the backyards across the vast residential landscape of LA. And you can see on this map at the left that kind of lamb chop shape going down in a small narrow band from the massive land use cluster at the top is Los Angeles, and the yellow is all residential. Something like 85% of the land in Los Angeles is residential. And most of that, by far, another lion's share, is zoned single family. So for 10 years, as the top of the slide banner indicates, we undertook a range of research projects to better understand both how this naturally occurring affordable housing was happening and what was restricting it from developing further. It turns out that it was all illegally built, informally built, and that means that there was a huge need for it because people were placing labor into the construction of buildings that couldn't be converted necessarily into land value upon the sale of their property. And you can see in this upper center slide where we began working in what we would call the low-hanging fruit, or the easiest places to begin thinking about adding accessory dwelling units or backyard homes. This is an area that's called Pacoima in Northeast Los Angeles County, and it's zoned for agricultural land, and the properties there are immense. They're 50 to 75 feet wide and as much as 350 feet deep. And you can see in this aerial that though that was originally planned for domestic agriculture or farm animals, now what's happening in the backyard is the addition of multiple, can you see my cursor? Multiple units. So many of them have 3 units behind the original house. We thought if we started where it was easiest to imagine adding secondary units or backyard homes or accessory dwelling units, ADUs, we might begin to unlock the DNA for the rest of the city. And part of our research was related to neighborhood council meetings, of which there are some 100 neighborhood councils, almost all of whom vocally are unsupportive of a policy change to add secondary units, but many of whom have secondary units in their own backyards. And if you're curious about that, we can talk about it in the question and answer period. One of the things we discovered was that there were lot types, property types in Los Angeles that would afford different circumstances for ADUs. And there's a myth in Los Angeles, I suspect these kinds of myths exist in many cities, that there's a standard lot here. The thought is that that's a 50 by 150 foot lot. But in fact, that's not even the median lot. There is no standard lot. It's really like a series of thumbprints, in part because as developers built the suburban fabric, they built it with their own property boundary model or pattern. And then people's additions to their houses have changed the buildable areas that remain. So when we were working at a local level, we studied all the different types of lots where secondary units would be most easily accommodated. And that was the large lot, like we saw in Pacoima, a corner lot where you'd have no driveway that had to be accommodated. So we'd have more of the lot to take up with housing rather than cars, and alley lots for the same reason, that you could park over a back garage and build a house on top. That there are 900 miles of alleys, and you can see I know almost everything there is to know about the possibilities of secondary lots, secondary houses in Los Angeles. And that took a lot of design research. We then thought we would propose locally different kinds of secondary units that would benefit the community, that this might be a way of gaining political support from the local city council. So a corner lot might give something back, a little library, a bench, a shade tree, a plant nursery, and an alley lot might regreen the alley, make it a safer place to live, add lighting. At each stage, our city council members, we would get almost a majority when one very loud neighbor in one district would come forward and convert the support into, a contradiction or contrary position, and we'd lose the vote. And we never were, in 10 years, able to pass legislation locally. This is just another instance of our design research. We were trying to build secondary units that would be highly sustainable. We built a full-scale mock-up. This was undertaken with Kevin Daly, architects and architecture graduate students at UCLA. This got us a lot of publicity, which was actually very helpful, and the attention of our local congressman, who invited me to help co-author legislation for ADUs, accessory dwelling units, at the state level. And we, knowing as much as we did basically about the Los Angeles case, I'll let this little video play for a moment since it has a soundtrack. We co-authored a new law, AB 2299, that at the state level incentivized rather than constrained the development of secondary units by removing parking requirements for any property within a 500-foot radius of a frequent transit stop. It turns out 85% of Los Angeles, a city not known for its public transportation, is within 500-foot radius. So most properties don't need to place any parking on the site. And secondly, that you could grandfather in existing garages that might be on the property line and build above them, so that there wasn't the need to demolish what might already be informally used as affordable housing to add new housing. So all of this together made for an extremely successful bill that's had tremendous effects on the production of secondary units. Because as a demonstration of cityLAB's multiple tentacles into the production of affordable housing, we discovered that even planning departments didn't understand how to apply the new legislation during the first year. So we also wrote a guidebook that's been published over and over online and in hard copy to help both planning departments and homeowners figure out how to build an ADU, because there still are kind of arcane legislative components. And we found in further research that 55% of those ADUs that are built are rented below market rate. So there is a good contribution to affordability. You can see from the chart on the left, when the law was written, there was a very restrictive law that was on the books prior to 2016. And in the very first year that the law made ADUs legal under our new guidelines, in California, 5,000 permits were issued. And by 2019, that number had almost tripled. In some ways, I'm actually even more pleased by the proliferation of new versions of the secondary units or backyard homes that has occurred since the ADU law we co-authored has passed. One of those is something called the Standard Plan Program that the Los Angeles Mayor's Office issued. It was something that we looked at extensively during our 10 years of research. Could we, in fact, develop a set of secondary unit plans that could be pre-approved by the Building and Safety Department, reducing the cost to homeowners and the timeline, which is a large part of the costs of building a housing unit? The mayor's office invited 15 architects initially to submit plans, which the building department approved. I'm just showing you 4 of those. And now any architect who is interested can submit a plan to the Standard Plan Program. The building department reviews it, determines if it can received pre-approval, and it's accessible then to homeowners who might like to try a version that would have to get tailored, of course, to their own backyards. Another and even more exciting aspect of the ADU law is, while our notion was to double the density of the suburbs, which when we started talking about that in 2006, it was a kind of heresy in Los Angeles. Now, the idea 2 years ago, so our law passed in 2016, it became law January 1st, 2017. By 2019, you could have another unit on the site with a revision to our law that had something that was called a junior ADU. In other words, you could carve a small unit out of an existing house in addition to adding a new accessory dwelling unit. So you could actually have 3 units on the site. Just passed in September, a little over a month and a half ago, was a new state legislation that allows 4 units per site. And while the ADU law was only for rental, now you can subdivide a site into 2 parcels, and each of those parcels can have a secondary unit. In some ways, this is addressing what we in the United States have come to understand as the racial injustice that's baked into the suburban land pattern of land ownership that was primarily directed towards white early homeowners and persists in the way the zoning operates. And by breaking down the land into smaller parcels, we open that land to more economic groups, and by virtue of the connections between race and economics, more racial groups. cityLAB continues to see how we might develop affordable housing in the suburban land patterns that we find across the United States and also outside of Melbourne and other cities of Australia and elsewhere in the world. Because we couldn't guarantee affordability in the ADU law, since each housing unit would be built by the homeowner, we started looking for publicly held land where we could ensure that the housing that might be built there could be controlled for affordability and for households in need. And the most obvious site for that, and I suspect the same will be true in Melbourne and other Western cities, is the Schoolyard. In California, we have almost 11,000 school properties. And in every county, our research over the past year has shown, there are properties that are potentially developable for affordable housing. Since starting teachers in California rarely can afford to live in their districts if they're in an urban district, there's a real pressure on schools to build housing for their workforce. And we've been studying some 46 districts that are trying to build what we're calling education workforce housing. Only 4 developments have actually happened so far. And we've just finished a significant report and handbook that will now be the basis for developing new policies to enable schoolyard housing or education workforce housing across the entire state. This is the most recent project, conceptual project that we've undertaken. Again, the focus on spatial justice and affordable housing as the primary means through which architectural research can begin to address injustices. We're looking at the future of housing and community development in the whole state of California in a statewide run program, trying to see if we think of housing on one dimension as a human right or as an invention, which you see on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, housing that's we're producing a lot of it or almost none of it. And at the moment, we are in the lower left quadrant, which we're calling new feudalisms, low production and housing as investment. which is a kind of dystopic view that's characterized by the way our cities in California and across the United States and across much of Europe as well look today, which is with a large homeless population and luxury housing being built at the same time, with a great deal of protectionism happening in the suburbs as they watch new forms of density being proposed there. In the upper right quadrant, where we have high production and housing as a human right, there's a sense that we can create a state in which all members of our population will be able to live decent and dignified lives with permanent supportive housing. So you can see this is now becoming part of a state-generated document with these different scenarios laid out here. Our work was on housing and community development. There were 13 other teams dealing with various other aspects of planning in the state of California. And this is my last slide, just showing you again that there's another strategy that we're taking of design research at cityLAB. This is opened in the month of September of this year, just this fall when students came back to UCLA. It's shelter beds, if you can imagine, but destigmatized, made for long distance commuters and housing insecure students who basically come to campus from long distances because they live at home where rents are lower, where they support families, and can stay here for a couple of hours or overnight. There are 5 of these pods, Bruin Hub pods that you see in the foreground that students can reserve. And there are 5 more that are being delivered to campus in the coming week. And we hope that this becomes a model for universities across the country and the world to help deal with housing insecurity among their own student populations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dana. Fantastic presentation. So much for us to learn here in Melbourne, especially. I will throw straight to Maryam, please, if you're with us for the second presentation. Welcome, Maryam Gusheh from.
Hi, Rory, can you hear me? I hope that you can hear me. Thanks very much, Rory. It's great to be here to present to you some of the work we've done at Monash. The talk is particularly focused on a studio that we ran earlier this year called Retrofit Kit, which was participated by Masters of Architecture students. So just to acknowledge the team, the studio was led by Nigel Bertram and supported by 2 studies units that were taught by myself, Catherine Murphy and Tom Morgan. And I'd also really like to acknowledge the work of all the participating students who were very much the engines in the studio producing much of the research, and I'll be using their work throughout the presentation today. So it's very much on behalf of Nigel and the larger research team that I'm presenting this work. Just by way of a very quick introduction, just to set the project within today's theme that Rory set out. Yes, we were very much working on retrofitting the city, thinking about systematic ways in which we can retrofit common building types across Melbourne, and very much in context of disability. So we were looking at strategies that could help us retrofit homes at scale to make these more seamless, more dignified environments for people with disability. The studio is part of a larger collaboration with Dr. Ben Gauntlet, who's the Disability Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Centre in Australia. And Ben has been working with us for over a year, and our work together is really looking at ways in which we can increase the supply of quality homes for people with disability, particularly people are living in existing housing stock at the moment, which is not really meeting their needs. And in addition, in context of this studio, Ben was the client for the project. He set out the brief for the student and really participated closely with us in setting out this issue of housing from a human rights perspective, the rights to housing, but also very much from his first-hand experience of living with a disability and the spatial and environmental implications of that. So at the first stage of our engagement with the Australian Human Rights Commission, we conducted a scoping study of current approaches to adaptable housing for people with disability. And I'd just like to say some just early observations about the outcomes that came out of this report, because the report essentially then served as the briefing document for the studio work that we did. Now, there's some statistics which help to paint a picture of the problem that we were dealing with. There's 4.4 million people with disability who live in Australia, and 77% of whom have a physical condition which impacts their mobility. Age correlates strongly with disability, and Australia has an increasing aging population. So disability impacts, quite a proportion of the Australia's population. And of the roughly 10 million existing dwellings, really, none of these meet accessibility requirements, and with the 50 to 80 years average lifespan, the adaptability of these homes is significant in context of disability, but really also when thinking about more broadly about equitable cities. Some observations from the report are important to our approach. One of them is that the current approach to the regulatory and economic support for disability housing is very much around specialised hard care housing provision, much needed area. This very specialised housing, which represents about 4% of people with disability. At the same time, the policy around accessibility standards, universal access codes, are very much focused on new housing and future housing development. And whilst there have been really significant gains made in this area, this leaves 96% of people with disability that live in existing dwellings, most of these homes which are not really suitable to their needs. There's very little economic and regulatory support, and there's no mandatory standards for adapting these existing homes. So all this kind of adds together to paint a picture of a very large-scale urban and housing issue which needs strategic attention. As I mentioned, a scoping report in essence became a briefing document for ongoing research with the Human Rights Commission, and there's maybe three key points to emphasize here is that the work that we're doing is very much focused on existing housing stock and existing city grain. We're very much looking at the 96% of people with disability that are outside of the high care and specialised needs. And we're really considering the problem through design principles and systematic strategies that could be replicable and applied at scale. So all of this informed the approach to the Retrofit Kit studio that we ran at Monash. And from the outset, the studio started with certain principles that we were keen for the students to engage with. The first one was accessible homes are better homes for all. So we were really interested in encouraging the students to think about this possibility of adaptation for accessibility, not just in terms of codes or safety and access, but really as an opportunity to improve this housing stock in many ways and for many people. And we also, from the outset, sort of developed a broad definitions of accessibility with themes, sort of aligning accessibility with themes about quality of homes, themes that had fairly direct architectural implications, such as flexibility, dignity of an environment, seamlessness, and so on. And these were sort of set out at the beginning for us to kind of keep in mind as we worked through the studio. Now, as I mentioned, our focus was on at-scale application, and so we really approached this from a typological perspective, working with the existing grain of the suburbs and working with the common housing types, particularly in context of Melbourne. And we chose the housing types along the sort of timeline of Melbourne's development in the post-war era, from the 1950s, weatherboard houses all the way to kind of the more later garage houses. And the range of building types was also selected for diversity of architectural situations, as well as types that exist in clusters within specific suburbs, but also across the city. And so the students really began their study with very close observation of these housing types, documenting them through both first-hand experience and also historical research, and preparing a series of analytical studies that captured the main feature of these housing. And I'm just showing you here examples of one series of analysis, which was the walk-up apartment blocks. And you can see this sort of documentation in terms of plot size and levels and flats. And these type of studies were then repeated across other housing types, brick veneer houses, for example, with a very similar set of documentation. And then as a group, this led to a fairly comprehensive, detailed documentation and analysis of these building types, where students are really looking at common family resemblances across the genealogy and commonalities, which then may inform strategies for at-scale adaptation. These analyses are also conducted at an urban scale, where the students were looking at the proliferation of some of these housing types across Melbourne suburbs, the number of types, and just trying to build up an argument for the possibility of at-scale adaptation. These urban studies also included the mapping of these houses relative to other urban amenities. For example, outdoor spaces, transport, proximity to places of work. And these studies were quite interesting because the students started to develop some predictions as recommendations about the Melbourne suburbs that particularly suited people with disability, not so much in context of the particular home environment, but its proximity to other urban amenities. Then from this early analytical stage, we moved on to case study design projects, where the students worked with specific example of these housing types and looking at space and elements that they could revise or adapt or add in order to modify these houses. These design work very much, again, was tied to the earlier typological investigations, where the students have prepared very kind of detailed descriptions of the features of the buildings, but also their challenges in context of accessibility and opportunities that they saw in terms of what was possible in terms of adaptation. And then they worked on this very economical, quite concise propositions for adapting these homes, working very much in terms of existing and then renovated propositions. And I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but in the bottom drawing, we're looking at, for instance, the incorporation of a lift to allow vertical circulation. But these propositions the students are working with are always developed in context of other opportunities to add amenity to the dwelling. So we have in this instance the lift that's integrated with balcony spaces, which add quite a lot of amenity to the individual apartments. And this manner of working was then developed in terms of a series of recommended strategies communicated in quite abstract terms, but in terms that would have immediate application at scale, strategies that we thought could be applied beyond that specific case that the students were looking at across that building type. And, then these strategies were tested for the formal implication and then visualized in terms of some of the new spatial propositions that enabled, for example, here, the new balcony spaces that would be adjacent to the lifts. So the students worked in groups across the building types and working very much at this stage with the particular features of the different dwellings. So the garage house, we see that the focus was very much on the garage component of the house, looking at what converting a 2-car garage space to a 1-car garage space enabled. And in this case, we can see that the garage conversion allowed for the creation of a new entry sequence that resolved level access and enabled level access, allowed a dual key access within the dwelling for a private bedroom and bathing facility that was fully accessible. So the focus was very much about this quite discrete but impactful alterations that were very much conceived of in context of specific building types. And what was interesting here is that some of the student work really started to look at some elements of these dwellings, such as the garage door, and rethinking the composition structure of these elements. The garage door in this instance converted to an element with multiple opening, a front door, as well as the fold-up screens, and really showing that through just the renovation of that one architectural element, the potential of the garage to serve multiple purposes was unlocked. And again, just sort of studies of some of the features which really would solving level access issues, but we're adding substantial amenity to the dwelling itself. And this initial case study of specific housing types were developed by the different student groups. So we had a comprehensive set of recommendations where then communicated as how-to guides of what was possible within the specific house context. And one of the discoveries in this process was that there were these common elements, the entry, foyer, kitchen, and so on, that the students found that working in these common elements was really, really necessary for resolving the accessibility issues in these houses, but also in terms of improving the qualities of houses in all sorts of other ways. So we moved on to start to collate all the different ways in which, for example, a garage had been adapted within these various projects, and to name these. So half garage, high amenity garage door examples that I just showed you in context of the garage house. And this naming process was really helpful because it started to link strategies that were initially conceived in terms of accessibility to larger qualitative ambitions, for example, issues of sociability and safety and architectural performance. And by kind of capturing this across the different spatial units, we started to develop this sort of kit of parts, certainly at the level of strategy, where one could select the most appropriate elements depending on the situation and condition of the individual house. And then as a sort of final stage of the studio, we were really keen to test some of these strategies at one-to-one scale, through material testing. And this was done by working with the students to communicate the results of the studio in context of an exhibition in our gallery at Monash, the Mother Gallery, which you can see an image of on the left. And we kind of took over the gallery and started to design an exhibition that was very much framed as a simulated home environment. So working with the logic of the gallery, working through an entry area, a converted garage space, a kitchen element and bathing area. And so then the students really working with the specifics of this exhibition in mind started to develop these spatial elements in terms of some of those name strategies that they had set aside originally, but also in terms of furniture elements that enable some of the activities in these spaces. And so you'll see here that we're starting to work from the level of the strategy in context of the specific spatial units, and then a series of infrastructure and furniture elements that were very much designed in terms of modular units that could be chopped and changed depending on the specific environment. And I'm just going to step you through this quite quickly, just to give you an indication of this level of work, where you kind of start to see, for example, the garage door element reappear now being tested through these drawings and consideration that start to think about their fabrication, and the kitchen and bathroom and so on. And so the students then worked on these elements through really working primarily with timber. So this large scales one-to-one mock-ups that then they would test in context of the gallery environment. And so this was the sort of the final stage of the studio, and we had aimed to have the exhibition earlier this year, but it's been interrupted a couple of times by the lockdowns. But we're very much hoping to bring all these elements back together for an exhibition in March, which will be included in the Melbourne Design Week. So the material that I've drawn together in this presentation is very much from the pamphlets and catalogues that were designed for this exhibition, and they're seen as these how-to guides for the renovations of our suburbs, so they are accessible and better quality homes for everyone. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Maryam. Fantastic work. I'm very much looking forward to the exhibition. We might bring Dana in to the room as well. Hi, Dana. Thank you. Hi. So I've got a couple of questions. I've just been generously offered another 5 minutes from Alan. So we've got about, 15 to 20 minutes for a discussion, and we've got a handful of comments and questions in the chat. Please post some more questions from the audience, would be fantastic. But I wanted to first ask you both about the role of the university in shaping, I guess, the city, industry, and these broader questions, which we normally consider beyond the scope of what the university can do, certainly in architecture. So perhaps we'll start with you, Dana. I mean, it's a wonderful trajectory where you'd begun the research within your unit and then were approached by congressmen to make it policy.
Yeah, that was fortuitous, and we're meeting with him again this month and next to work on the next set of policies. And I think what I wasn't aware of was that the sort of clout and reputation of the university mattered a great deal at the state legislative level. So we actually partnered with UC Berkeley, our sister, the two primary universities of California, and together the congressman used that, at Berkeley and UCLA, the research shows, and we were very proud to be part of that. I mean, that's an obvious way the university holds an important role in the affordable housing process. Clearly for me, and I can see for Maryam too, the students who are in university and who aren't thinking in conventional ways because they're not as indoctrinated as those of us who've been in housing for decades. They think outside the box, and so they can work on a suburban house like Maryam's students and try to retrofit them. And my students, don't think of a commuting student's shelter in the same way that, say, a policymaker would. They think of it from their own experience. So I feel like the, sort of brilliance of the students is a really important part. And the only last thing I'd say is we at UCLA have an amazing array of, in this research university, as at University of Melbourne, other departments, other experts, all people who are really dedicated to larger public good kinds of concerns. So I have social justice collaborators in planning to English literature. And that kind of consortium of thinkers is really invaluable as critics and generators of new ideas.
And Maryam, that seems critical to your work as well, which is the partnership with these charities for disability.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at Monash, I work with the Urban Lab, which is, uses very similar methods at the cityLAB that Dana's already discussed. So we lead, through practice-led approaches, but I think the really fortunate positions we have is that we can work with many institutions and across the research labs within the university. So I think that opportunity to be able to integrate research and the opportunity to have time to spend on the research phase is a luxury that the university's environment really enables. And, we've done even just within Monash, working with, for example, other labs that are looking at emergent technologies of production is the next stage for this project for us, where we can kind of start to talk at the latest research that's coming out of this. But I think having the infrastructure such as the cityLAB or the Urban Lab that enables this integrated approach and working with students is really critical. It's a generous environment.
Something you said, Maryam, I'd just like to pick up on, which is there's also a kind of neutrality in the university that's extremely important given how politicized housing has become. So obviously we all have biases and agendas, ours being, a very explicit one, but we're also seen as being serious researchers. So that if there's any role for data and evidence in our, partisan universe now, the university can bring that forward and represent a set of data and facts that can be debated, more reasonably than all of the predetermined notions and myths that come, especially around the suburbs.
Yeah, fascinating, fantastic. I wanted to ask one more question, and then I'll go to the audience questions, which is around scale and how to operate within the suburbs. I mean, I think what's fascinating in both of your presentations is that we're seeing the whole scale of the city, even the scale of the state for you, Dana, and then we're zooming into the scale of the lot, to the neighborhood, the house, and it's this constant contraction of all of these different issues, and thinking how things are replicatable across, in some cases, millions of lots. So perhaps you could speak about this flexibility of mind required to operate in the ways that you are.
I was really struck when Maryam was talking about her typologies, that is one strategy we also use. I mean, when when I began the backyard homes work, my colleagues in the architecture department said basically the kind of things you said in the introduction, Rory, like, this isn't architecture. What are you doing? You know, you should be in a planning or real estate program. I said, no, you know, I think this is going to make a lot of work for you guys, especially you young architects. There's a lot of building to be going on here. We just have to figure out how to take the finger out of the dike, basically. And to do that, when you are working from the tiniest scale to the largest scale, I think one of the best strategies is typological. And to figure out what lot types are, or in Maryam's case, housing types, and how you might address something like housing production or housing affordability or housing for all through a typological strategy is one way to bridge that tiny to massive model.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really came across to us where we were looking at this current approaches to housing provision within the disability context was that, you know, within the architectural and urban planning skill set, analysis of housing types, you know, is a skill that we have and deploy commonly when we teach and think about studio. But this knowledge and skill set is not really carried across to the, you know, space of thinking about these issues, disability and housing provision. So I think, you know, at least within the Australian context, the contribution of architects and architectural thinking to this space has been really minimal. And so part of the exercise is how can we use skills we have and then leverage these in terms of coming up with better solution for this at scale application. And certainly, you know, typological work we found it to be very productive.
Thank you, Maryam. A question for you, Dana, from the chat, actually from two questions. Adam Hogan and Ben Thorpe have both asked about the I guess the consequences of the densification that you've described on things like landscape, urban heat island, green space, stormwater, etc. What are the extra pressures that are happening now in this land use?
Well, I was reading the questions from the chat, and several of them have to do with environmental issues, and it's really an important component. Let me start by saying that our starting point was to not remove or demolish housing as the first act of sustainability, that if we could preserve an existing housing stock and build on it, we would be environmentally ahead of the game. And then in our own experiments in cityLAB, we took the kinds of questions that the audience is raising really seriously. The little demonstration house we did was actually a biome that took the backyard as a biome. We were trying to preserve all of the natural landscape and flora and fauna that we found there through a new building type. When I got the legislation to the state level, I lost one key battle, and I think Australia has had more success in its ADU, in some of its ADU legislation than we did, which was I tried to keep the maximum size of ADUs down to 600 square feet. And I lost that in all of the lobbying to 1,200 square feet. So there's a real problem in my mind with permeable surface, with the tree loss that we might, and that's one of the things we heard a lot about in the neighborhood organizations. I think there hasn't been follow-up studies yet. I'd love to do them to find out whether we have those kinds of problems and when we've been able. Some cities have reduced the size, and I'd like to be able to compare the cities that had a smaller footprint than those cities. You were able to customize the ADU law at the city level so long as you didn't place new barriers in the way. And some of them are actually much more respectful of the environmental implications, as the questioners are indicating. So that would make for a great piece of research.
Thanks, Dana. I wanted to ask both of you about the, I guess, social consequences of the incremental work that you're doing. We focus a lot about numbers and density and people and housing and so on. But there's this secondary consequence, I guess, which is the vibrancy of the neighbourhood and the connection to services. And both of you have mentioned, reorienting lots towards streets and to, I guess, encourage that public life that comes with greater density. Perhaps, Maryam, you could describe how that applies to somebody who may be disabled and how they may live in their home and connect to the street.
Yeah, so I think because, for us, really, the disability was an entry into this work. And then we were thinking about, if you're going to adapt this home, how do you improve it for everyone who lives in the house? So including the family and the carers and then subsequent people who might live there. So we were really keen to, at every element of the operation was on one hand very, how would you say, kind of very tightly controlled to be as minimal as possible, but then with maximum impact. So for every element of alteration, we were thinking about the additional qualities that it would serve. So some of these connectivity issues were really important for us, the connection to the neighborhood, connection to the street, air, light, and so on. So the students, did this very interesting series of studies where they first worked out the most minimal move that they could make to make their home accessible, but then what added value this could have for making the neighborhood more vital, as you say. So, really the entire studio's premise was, how can accessibility open a framework for improving not only the house, but the entire neighborhood?
In our case, I think there were two primary social repercussions that are about neighborhood scale. The first one was really about getting rid of cars. And while we haven't gotten rid of them entirely by any means, the fact that the whole legislation is based around public transportation is a mind shift and also an everyday practices shift away from carbon, basically. That to me seems like it puts people back on the sidewalks and puts people on buses. And if the pandemic allows us to repopulate the public transit systems again, which are really expanding in Los Angeles, I think we'll see that that density has made a difference. The second primary way is maybe a more complex one, and it has to do with the same issues Maryam's talking about, and that has to do with neighborhood stability and diversity. So if we can make it so that people can stay in their residences as the whole economy of their everyday lives change, for instance, in aging, after their children have moved out, their houses are not right-sized any longer, they retire, their incomes aren't the same, those people are all much more likely to move if they can't find a flexibility in their own property that the ADU gives them. So I think the long-term studies will show that we have much, and I think you would already find that that's why people built ADUs that weren't even legal, that were informal, because of all of those pressures. So the on the lot civility, the way a suburban lot becomes more civil to its occupants by being more flexible, has a further implication of creating stability in the neighborhood so that social networks that are really important for people who are aging in place can remain intact. And I don't know, that part's been really exciting. We soon came to the conclusion that really everyone had a backyard home story. And it was really true. There were as many different uses for a second unit on the property as there were property owners.
Mm. Yeah, I'll just add to that. One of the observations that the students came up with was how valuable a garage was. That the houses that had garages could really be converted so easily in so many different ways. And it was that was a winning ticket for these conversions for us. So, if you had a garage, the issues of level access could be easily resolved. The garage in terms of a separate amenity, allowing sort of the house to have better economic performance by allowing sublets and so on, some of the issues that Dennis talked about. So it's really interesting, this car space then really opened up the possibility for the house to operate in all of these different, quite important ways.
Mm. And it's, I mean, it's such a different conversation from the one that's, I think, leading here at the moment, which is so much about the missing middle, and which I understand to be actually a demolition of the existing house, a replacement with something, with a sort of small size apartment building in the suburbs, which leads to all of those consequences that you described, people being displaced, the neighbourhood and community bonds being eroded, and so on. We've got about 2 minutes to go, so I'll ask one final question before we let you go, which is around the consequences of the pandemic. We've all been working from home, or many of us, and many of us have not, but it's completely reshaped our relationship to neighbourhoods in many cases. We're spending a lot more time in our homes, and this seems to perhaps have accelerated some of the ideas that you've been describing. So I wanted to ask both of you, how has that changed the way you've been thinking about your work?
For me, for sure, the biggest pandemic implication has been the lifting up of the inequities between those of us who have a decent home, who have jobs that can be done from home, from those whose houses might be overcrowded and who have are part of the essential workforce. So it's really raised the question of new kinds of affordability, of sort of working within what we call NOAA's naturally occurring affordable housing, and how much priority as architects we need to place on that. In some ways, suburb, first ring suburb, exurb, all of those have to get now seen through this lens of spatial justice, in my mind.
Thanks, Dana. Maryam, a quick response?
Yeah. Just, I mean, really, the pandemic has really shown what many members of the society have already been experiencing, particularly those with a disability who are really confined to their home environment. And it sort of alerted everyone else of what some of the shortcoming means for people who are not only confined their own home environments, but really don't have the ability to visit their family and friends in all of this existing housing stock. I mean, that's one thing that was really pointed to us, is that people cannot go beyond their own homes, even if they are adapted to visit family and friends. So I think it's really heightened that attention needs to be paid to this space in terms of equity and justice in the city.
Absolutely. Now, that's the end. It's been such a pleasure having both of you. Thanks so much for your time. Lovely to see you, Dana. Thanks for zooming in to us all the way from LA. And thank you, Maryam, for your wonderful contribution, bringing the Australian story to light. A quick announcement, which is just to say that the next session with Alan Pert and Michael Maltzan, another LA story, is starting at any minute now in the next session. And finally, a huge thank you to Dana and Maryam. Wonderful session. Thank you.